Okay, we should start. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Rahel Jaeggi, who is a professor of philosophy at Humboldt University in Berlin. And since 2018, she's also director of the university's Center for Social Critique. She's one of the most prominent representative of critical theory in Germany, Europe, and I'd say the US as well. And she is the author of numerous books, including Alienation, translated into English and published in 2015. Critique of Forms of Life, Harvard University Press, 2018. With Thilo Wäsche, Was ist Kritik, 2009. And the most recent book that I ordered 1 month ago from Germany, but I'm still waiting for that. Sometimes the connection between Europe and the US are really bad, or something happens and the books get stuck. And the title of the new book is Fortschritt und Regression, Progress and Regression. And Rahel is currently a fellow at the Thomas and House in Los Angeles. Join me to welcome Rahel Jaeggi, and you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I was looking forward to this for a long time, and we have been in conversation for a long time, so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here today and to see your wonderful Santa Cruz Zauberberg. I mean, I'm living in some kind of Zauberberg right now, because Mannhausen specifically says that this is as beautiful as this view and the surroundings. So what I'm going to do is actually give you a brief insight into what I've been doing in my book Progress and Regression, which will be out in English only in the fall 25. But at least this we know. I mean, everything's settled so far. Let me start with some remarks. That progress somehow exists, is hard to deny. Until the discovery of penicillin in 1928, people could die from, by today's standards, harmless infections. In the Middle Ages, scriptures were copied by hand, a time-consuming process. The invention of letterpress printing spurred immense proliferation of written texts. Today, my laptop's computing power easily exceeds what was available for the Apollo 11's guidance computer from 1960. And only a few decades ago, you needed to have change on hand and wait in line at phone booth just to quickly call someone. Today, we are in touch with the whole world at all times, and my son finds it hard to imagine a social life without smartphones. He also has trouble imagining a time when women were not allowed to vote, children were legally beaten at school and at home, and homosexuality was a punishable offense in Germany, at least. Here, too, I guess. That there is progress in some areas or in some respects, even if it might, in Nestroy's words, sometimes look greater than it actually is thus a triviality. The less trivial questions are why and in what respect the developments I mentioned are not just changes in general, but changes for the better. What and who brings them about, and whether and how the various developments are interrelated. Is there progress? In a sense, this is a misguided question. There's no doubt that instances of progression exist, progress in the sense of enhancements here and there. However, whether something that corresponds to a strong notion of progress exists, and whether the many small or local advances lead to progress in a comprehensive sense is up for debate. Progress is a normatively charged interpretative pattern, a narrative that serves to establish a particular conception of social and historical processes. Progress is not simply out there. When we speak of progress, we don't refer to bare events, to brute facts, but to our understanding of them, our evaluation of what has happened, and our expectations for what it is, what is to come. We conceive of something as progress and thus relate historical and social events to each other, which we claim to evaluate and understand. It is then very well possible that there is no state in world history in which things do not, in fact, change for the better or worse. However, not all of these changes are perceived as progress or regression. So what does it mean to understand social change as a movement of progression, or respectively, of regression? How can the concept of progress help us to understand, as Wendy Brown says, I quote, where we have come from and where we are going? If going means towards things like emancipation, or at least away from the multi-layer crisis we currently find ourselves in. And in which respect does it prevent us, does the very notion of progress and regression prevent us from understanding this? It seems the concept of progress can only be defended if it can be reconstructed and understood in light of its most valid critique. Such a preserving or rescuing critique must first address the implications and political philosophical semantics of the concept and identify those elements that are in need for reconstruction. This is what I intend to do in the first part of this lecture. I will outline 4 central features of the progress narrative and explain the respective problems they pose. I will then, in the second part of my lecture, present an alternative conceptualization of progress suited to deal with the previously formulated critique without sacrificing the explanatory function progress and regression have for making sense of social change. And then in the last part, I'm going to say a couple of words on the very notion of regression as I see it as the other side of progress. So I mean, one of the reasons why I was engaging in this project was that whereas progress has become a very bad name, I mean, everyone was like, oh my God, you really believe in progress, and how could you? But the concept of regression was very much a couple of years ago, since this book did not progress as quickly as I wanted it to. Regression was everywhere. I mean, everyone, or a lot of people would analyze the authoritarian movement and our current situation in terms of regression. And then one of the things here was you cannot talk about. I mean, these are, two sides of the same. I mean, in both respects, we have some idea of, let's say, an accumulation or a learning process and a process of unlearning. I mean, not in a good way, but in a bad way, or blocked learning processes. And unless you are ready to defend some notion of progress, you cannot analyze our current situation in terms of regression. Of course, there are a lot of people who would easily give up on both. And just also mention this because my reason for trying to reconstruct progress is certainly not that I'm more optimistic than anyone else with respect to like empirical progress. My aim here is to work on to do some conceptual work in order to understand what, if there was such a thing as progress and regression, what would this look like, and how to conceptualize this, and just to spell out the connection to critical theory. It is an important insight, I think, that even if the first generation of critical theory certainly was not optimistic in terms of, and was not in favor of a like naive concept of progress, not only was their take on progress much more complicated than one might think, it's also that regression plays such an important part in, for example, their analysis of fascism. So it does make a difference whether you, and this is why I try to hold on to what I call the explanatory and analytical part of this concept. It does make a difference whether you conceive of fascism as like morally evil, or the bad, whether you only have a normative judgment on fascism, or whether you have this kind of analytical as well as normative judgment that comes with understanding fascism in terms of regression. So this is just to give you some background of what I've been doing here and trying. So first part, back to progress. I'm going to quickly talk about those 4 features of progress, the critique of those 4 features, and then some way to get out of there. And then the second part is more constructive. So 4 features of progress. The first feature I'm going to I should mention is what Stephen Luke calls the unbreakable chain of progress. This considers the interrelation of various dimensions of progress. As my few previous examples should indicate, there are very different developments that can be understood as progress. Medical and scientific achievements, technical inventions, social innovations, the change of moral convictions, or political reforms and revolutions. In order now to understand the political and historical semantics of the term progress, including the euphoria it was once able to trigger and the power it still has today, we must disclose its original views. When progress became the guiding principle of an epoch in the European 18th century, all those different developments it could refer to were conceived as parts of one comprehensive movement. Talk of progress did not refer only to the growth of individual skills, nor to moral purification alone, but encompassed the improvement of human living conditions as a whole. Stephen Luke thus emphasizes the confluence of a wide variety of developments that shape progressive thinking. I quote, "The growth of the economy, of theoretical as well as practical scientific knowledge, and an increase in justice, virtue, and happiness, all this come together as if connected by an unbreakable chain." And I mean, you will find, one obviously finds the traces in Marx's historical materialism. So the idea that the changes that happen in one realm somehow influence, let's say the least, or bring about changes in the other one. Second feature. Let me see where. Yeah. Second feature. The second characteristic states that progress is an event that, as Cosell describes it, takes place with a seemingly supra-individual and irresistible force, prevails and is accepted with an almost fatalistic attitude. Progress does not seem in any simple or direct sense man-made, but rather as an expression of that which is, to quote Hegel, bound to happen, as an scientist. As a simultaneously anonymous and historical power, progress comes to meet the subject seized by it like a transpersonal subject of action. The normative self-assurance of the protagonists of progress, the fact that they almost self-evidently evaluate the developments they face as change for the better, seems to be related to this irresistible dynamic. The third feature. This assumption of irresistibility leads to the third feature, which is almost inseparable from the idea of progress in its classical guise, the idea of the logic of development. According to this idea, progress is a world historical process that is normatively binding and follows a single and evolutionary pattern. Whether conceived as development or maturation, progress is then understood as a type of social change that follows a prefabricated and binding path. Turgot already hints at this in quite a revealing way. I quote, "And if one looks at the human species from its origins, it appears in the eyes of the philosopher like a great whole, which, like every individual, has its childhood and makes progress." The idea of a development of humanity from childhood to maturity thereby implies not only an overarching context in which all the ages are linked together, as Turgot says, together by a succession of causes and effects that connects the present state of the world with all those states which preceded it. That was a Turgot quote again. It also assumes in an alienatingly paternalistic and imperialistic attitude a hierarchy of the stages of development. I'm going and I come into the critique of those features, of course, in a while, but let me quickly mention the fourth feature as well. A further consequence of this idea of a learning or developmental process is the notion that progress is to some extent linear, without losses and cumulative. Progress overcomes the given and replaces it with something better. Understood in this way, no ambivalence occur, nor is there a price to be paid for progress. So those were the four, features of the narrative of progress. And now I'm going to go through the critiques that most of you probably already are aware of, but let me mention them in order to figure out what it is that I want to somehow rescue from this. So the critique of progress. Now these four features of the progress narrative have all been decisively criticized, and any systematic theory of progressive social change must confront these objections. The euphoric assumption, getting back to the first feature, the euphoric assumption of a solid connection, the unbreakable chain between technical, social, moral, legal, and political progress that has inspired hopes of progress for so long, has considerably lost plausibility today. And so few still believe that digitalization or genetic engineering will lead directly and by themselves to moral or social improvements. While there was still unwavering faith in progress, every step forward, no matter how small, was happily inserted into a framework of overall progression. Today, such a totalizing perspective seems almost deterring. When in doubt, we hope at least for moral progress, although while technical progress is increasingly feared, albeit steadily advanced and constantly drawn on. Indeed, there's a valid argument that the discovery of penicillin or the invention of the washing machine or the printing press did not, at least not per se, lead to improved social or moral conditions. After all, it did not follow from the mere discovery of penicillin that everybody would have access to the medicine. I mean, same goes for the vaccinations, as we have experienced the last couple of years. But Benning had already warned not to lose sight of the fact that, I quote, the progress in the mastery of nature can also lead to the regress of society. Current philosophical discussions are then mostly devoted to the dimension of more narrowly directed moral or political progress. So the idea of the chain is given up. The second feature, progress as irresistible. Now the idea of the irresistibility and inevitability of progress, which was nourished by the connection of technical and social progression, has equally lost its persuasive power. In fact, many feel this irresistibility in the form of an unstoppable compulsion to grow has more of an impending doom than a promise. The idea of progress as a quasi-automatic historical movement, an evolutionary destiny independent of the will and volition of its actors, not only seems outdated, but has thoroughly discredited the concept of progress. I quote John Dewey, if we have been living in the fool's paradise, John Dewey wrote as early as 1916, in a dream of automatic, uninterrupted progress, it is well to be awakened. Today, we think of progress as the result of action. It does not happen by itself, but must be fought for. It is not irresistible, but on the contrary, beset by resistance and in any historical constellations, more improbable than probable. So the third feature, the imperialism of the concept. Finally, the notion of a developmental logic à la Turgot, which is also commonly attributed to Hegel's philosophy of history, seems to determine whether the motive of progress is still tenable at all for today's political enterprise. After all, a maturation model in which the various locally different developments are unified, subsumed, and reduced to a single evolutionary scheme of world historical movement leads to an intolerable hierarchization of the individual stages or developments. If progress proceeds according to a fixed plan and a binding pattern, those who do not conform to it are automatically marked as backward. They are, and that is the core of every theory of universal development, not just different, but not yet where they should be. Those who do not follow the development pattern of the so-called Western societies remain, as Deepesh Chakrabarty puts it into a powerful metaphor, in the waiting room of history. In this way, colonial relations of violence and exploitation are paternalistically justified, and the yet to be developed are led to their supposed happiness by domination, violence, and oppression. The concept would then be inseparably linked to the violent history of our global order insofar as it presents itself as a dubious template for various forms of ethnocentrism and imperialism, as an instrument of Western domination that has been used to legitimize hegemonic claims to power and exploitative and oppressive practices, and does so until today. But the paternalistic moments echoed in the motive of humanity's infancy and maturity, and the related attempt to establish a general standard of development, is not the only strong reason to be skeptical of the interpretative pattern of progress in normative terms. This development model is also questionable from a social theoretical perspective, that is, as a theory of social change. And now feature 4, the ambivalence of progress. The idea of progress as unbroken and linear accumulation then is also a poor compass for understanding social change. What it fails to accentuate is that with every achievement come moments of forgetting and unlearning. Unlearning, not in the good sense. Solutions to problems generate new problems, sometimes great ones. With a newly gained skill, an old one may be lost. We may find ourselves facing problems that have once been solved, but whose solutions are no longer accessible. So is progress a change for the better? Hard to make out in world affairs? Is it that things only get different but not better? Is it maybe impossible then to distinguish progressive from regressive forms of social change, given the shortcomings of the progress narrative? If all this was the case, we would have to adopt Michel Foucault's stance of methodological caution toward the idea of progress, what he called, I quote, radical but not aggressive skepticism that forbids us from taking our present for the end point of the progression, and thus endowing it with a positivity and evaluation. That was so a Foucault quote. The question, however, is whether we can afford this attitude. So now what is missing when we give up on what is missing if we give up on the concept of progress? In the following, I will try to briefly outline why we cannot stop at the critique of the concept of progress and what we lose if we give up the notion of progress and regression, or of progressive or regressive social change altogether. First, as implausible as the assumption of an unbreakable chain has become, if we don't take the obvious connections between the different changes in our forms of life into account, then we fail to recognize what I would like to call the materiality of forms of life. The conditions of social change are then understood all too idealistically. Even if one thing, such as political moral progress, does not directly and causally follow from another, for example, technical scientific progress, the reversement that both are completely independent of each other is equally unconvincing. Altered living conditions bring about social practices, change social practices, leading to new forms of coexistence and its normative organization. So this is actually a strongly materialistic point that would also lead to a materialistic conception of normativity, so to say. I mean, it has strong consequences for the way we conceive of normativity and norms and all. The reduction in child mortality due to scientific and technological progress has clearly been a factor increasing intimacy within family relationships in the bourgeois era. The printing press enabled the emergence of a bourgeois public sphere that functions as a prerequisite for modern democracies, and so on. It is unlikely that the revolution in information technology, which not only transforms communications, but also significantly reshapes our life and work relationships, would have no impact on the social, moral, and political order. Therefore, it is one of the key aspects of my project to reclaim a materialistic element in what drives and motivates progress against idealistic, voluntaristic, and normativist limitations. Secondly, the abandonment of the idea of progress would likely bring about a deficit in social theory that is especially alarming for critical theory. Nowadays, faith in the automatic nature of progress almost only exists as a strawman fallacy, and trust in the supra-personal logic of history has long been replaced by the idea of contingency and a voluntaristic trust in the will and choices of individual actors. While it is easy to discredit the notion of automatism or of a transpersonal subject of action, it is much more challenging to find a suitable interpretation of what unfolds in the interplay between events and structure, between the structural prerequisites of action and the action itself. Indeed, the answer to the question of who brings about social progress or social change at all and how is not straightforward. Social actors do drive change through their beliefs and actions. There is no fate nor a power that guides the world without the intervention of these actors. However, changes in society don't simply result from individuals changing their opinions and then adjusting their actions accordingly. And while it is correct to rely on social movements for social change, even these movements, and we did so for quite a while, of course, now facing social movements that might be considered regressive social movements. So even if it's correct to rely on social movements for social change, even these movements succeed not solely due to their courage and determination, but also because of other factors. Marx's insight that social revolutions have both active and passive elements applies here. They encounter preconditions, structures, historical opportunities, and are often triggered by crises and weaknesses in the existing system. They must react to these conditions in order to act effectively. Thirdly, the historical philosophical approach to relegate others to the waiting room of history is, of course, not only highly problematic, but also misleading. But how is one supposed to think about societies in critical analytical terms without developing a narrative of some sort that can grasp their transformations as crises, erosions, revolutions, and processes of change? It seems that no philosophy of history might not be a solution either. As Adorno in his ambivalence towards the philosophy of history has it, we can do with it, but we cannot do without it either, if we do not want to limit ourselves to the factual state of the world. And finally, while it is crucial not to approach the various temporalities and differences in local developments from the flattening and ideological universalist perspective of a universal history, we cannot afford pure localism and contextualism either, especially when we consider that, as Marx suggested, the world market is the world spirit. That is, when you consider the effective global historical entanglements and interdependencies. Precisely because the development of Europe, as Gominda Bambra points out, is not the result of an indigenous process, and because, as Stuart Hall emphasizes, the history of Europe is all too often narrated as if Europe had no outside, it is essential to trace the mutual entanglements from a global historical perspective. Perhaps now it is surprising that I have not yet discussed the normative significance of progress when addressing the question what is missing when we abandon progress. After all, many authors answer that question by pointing out that we would lack a normative guiding principle capable of directing our actions. But this is not my most pressing concern. In my view, we lose more and something different than just a normative foundation for social criticism when we abandon the concept of progress and regression. What we lose is an analytical and explanatory category. The question of progress, as Yves Winter aptly puts it, is not primarily and not exclusively a normative question, but above all a sociological and socio-philosophical one. This pertains not only to the criteria for what is good or desirable, but also concerns how a society functions and how one understands the conditions for social change. This very important aspect often gets overlooked amid controversies about the normative significance of the concept of progress. Progress, then, is neither a fact nor an idea, but, to put it in Marx's words again, the real movement of history. However, in the Hegelian sense, reality, the real movement, or the real part of the real movement, does not only refer to what actually empirically exists, but rather to that which, in its contradictions and crisis-ridden nature, has the potential to overcome what exists. In this sense, the criterion of progress always accomplishes both. comprehensive understanding of the existing and a critique that goes beyond it. With Adorno, I quote, "The concept of progress is philosophical in that it articulates the movement of society while at the same time contradicting it. Having arisen societally, the concept of progress requires a critical confrontation with real society. But how can we, develop an understanding of progressive social change that takes the critique of progress into account but still fulfills its task? The solution I want to propose is based on two conceptual points of departure. For one thing, I want to redefine the scope of progress. And the perspective I will propose here, wherever we experience progress, it is forms of life that change. The practices at work in this are interrelated in complex, albeit sometimes only loose ways. They influence each other reciprocally or are made possible by the same overarching developments. Progress is thus apprehensible as a complex mutual interaction of multiply interconnected ensemble of practices. Even if these elements do not come together to form an unbreakable chain, we will still encounter fragile yet effective connections. On the other hand, I do not understand progress in a substantial sense, but rather processual, as it were, as a process. Progress in this sense does not consist of achieving a specific and predetermined state or realizing a particular and predeterminable good. Instead, progress, in my understanding, is a mode, a way in which social change occurs. Or conversely, in the case of regression, does not occur. Progress, as I see it, is an accumulative process of problem solving, of overcoming crises and contradictions, while regression is its counterpart, a systematically blocked process of experience or learning, or experience is more apt actually, but it's the Hegelian notion of a Faros process, a process, an experiential process. Translation is always a bit problematic. So I'm not going to focus on the cognitive side of learning, but on something that's a bit more richer, more encompassing. So in the following, I will particularly focus on my second claim, that the idea that progress has to be understood and defined in a processual way, which then leads to hopefully a non-teleological but also non-contingency theoretical model of social change, which is supported by the idea of the logical history of the emergence and decline of institutions and social living conditions, which may be fragile but can at least be experienced with respect. Okay, so let's turn to the processual understanding progress. And they don't have what she did to tell me how in the person. I told 21 I didn't heard it right. Yeah. Okay, so the processual understanding of progress, which should lead us to this kind of non-teleological and different view of the process of progress. How can we develop an understanding of progressive social change that takes the critique of progress into account but still fulfills its tasks? In the second part of my lecture, I will first specify my concept of progress and formulate two initial theses. The first is that progress is a normative concept sui generis. Even if we associate with it a change for the better, progress is not dependent on a presupposed, already given understanding of the good or the right. On the contrary, the concept of progress itself contributes something to the determination of what is good or better. My second thesis is that progress is a processual concept. It denotes the quality of a development, a process of learning and experience, and thus a particular way in which social transformations take place. Sorry. So progress as change for the better in terms of progress, or at least moral progress, that was discussed in philosophy. What do we really ask about when we ask about progress? Moral progress is, in the first approximation, positively evaluated change in the generally accepted views politically consider and evaluate morally relevant questions of social life and the corresponding change in the design of institutions and practices that regulate this. But you can already see the pitfalls. Whether something is progress, regression, or neither is a matter of evaluating the change in question. Not everyone involved may see a particular development as progress. Especially at the beginning of transformation processes, the innovation in question are usually highly contested, and some changes are ambivalent in more than a superficial way. This shows the concept of progress has an evaluative component. Progress is not only a descriptive term, but also an evaluative. We do not simply state a change, for example, by noting that in the 60s, many classrooms in Germany were still equipped with a cane for the corporal punishment practices of children, whereas this is unthinkable today. Insofar as one perceives this change as progress, one also affirms it, evaluates it as good, appropriate, or beneficial. One then considers the beating of children as cruel and non-violent pedagogy, on the other hand, as appropriate. It is this evaluative, normative aspect that motivates Georg Henrik von Wicht to split the idea of moral progress into two independent components. Progress, I quote, is change for the better. Regression is change for the worse. The definition divides the concept into two components, the idea of change and the idea of good. And it's exactly this kind of split. I mean, while I agree that progress is certainly a normatively loaded concept, a normative concept, it is exactly this idea that this results in this kind of split. We have the good and we have the change. Part of it is something that I resist here. Van Richt thus distinguishes the descriptive aspect which describes change independently from normative evaluation from an ethical evaluative aspect, the notion of the good, by means of which this change can be evaluated as change for the better. Now, such a political distinction between two dimensions of the concept of progress may be useful, and the indication that progress is a normative concept is correct. However, it would be problematic to conclude from this that both aspects, the descriptive and the normative one, can be separated or understood independently of each other. On the contrary, it seems to be a specific characteristic of the concept of progress that in it both moments are inseparably intertwined. Thus it is true that the diagnosis of progress is based on an interpretation of events as progress, and that such an interpretation is always already normatively guided or imbued. But this does not mean that a descriptive moment, a description of change as mere normatively neutral change, can be separated from the ethical evaluative moment, hence the evaluation of this change as change for the better. In my view, such a separation or decomposition misses the point of the concept of progress and robs it of its specific content. This is clearly true with regard to its political historical semantics of Weber, but the systematic content and potential of the concept of progress, too, would be diminished by separating it into change on the one hand and goodness on the other. Progress, according to my thesis, belongs to the group of thick, analytical as well as descriptive terms, in which description and evaluation are indissolubly connected. In this sense, progress or progressive is a descriptive evaluation and an evaluative description. One would be meaningless without the other. The concept of progress shares this with concepts such as alienation, exploitation, cruelty, or kitsch. That is, with those thick ethical concepts that can be said to constitute the texture of a social world that is always already normatively composed and evaluatively colored. This now leads us directly to the problem of the normative autonomy of the concept. Indeed, the separation of the two dimensions of normative goodness and change amounts to a prioritization of the normative aspect, to what might be called a primacy of goodness over progress. Separating these dimensions, as Rick suggests, and as most the ontological conceptions of progress also imply, means that we would always first have to determine the good and distinguish better from worse to talk about progress. The good would then be the desired condition. The respective actual state of affairs can be compared to a particular movement, namely a movement toward this condition, could be recognized as progress. Progress is then I quote Rainer Faust, not a normative concept on its own right. This may sound intuitively plausible. So the first question talking about progress would always be, yeah, but progress towards what? I mean, don't you already need to know what you're aiming at? And part of my processual approach here is that you don't. That progress is not dependent on this kind of already established normative principles. So how it sounds intuitively plausible. How would you even know if it changes also progress without first identifying a desirable goal in light of which it can be evaluated? However, this approach has evident drawbacks. If we understand progress as a normatively derivative concept, then the assertion that the abolition of slavery or nonviolent education is progress easily translates to the claim that the achieved social state is morally good or right. Conversely, in this case, might show more clearly what is missing, the proposition that fascism or contemporary authoritarianism represent regression would boil down to the idea that they are morally evil or bad. The normative and analytical richness of the concept of progress and regression and its specific interpretative power are lost. Instead of being dynamically perceived as a transformation process towards the good, progress would be reduced to a static normative question. Ultimately, the concept of progress would be almost redundant compared to the concept of the good and superfluous for our normative vocabulary. So the first step in defending progress as sui generis normative concept, which is also a first step in conceiving progress in this processional manner that I suggest. So the first step is to overcome the notion that progress, in order to be considered as such, needs a clearly defined goal. So a widely held conception of progress suggests that, as I said, that its diagnosis depends on a prior determination of its goal. But this view is not without alternatives. Philip Kitcher, for instance, suggests that we should understand progress less as a movement towards a goal than away from a problem. Yeah, so this is Philip Kitcher. We should understand process less as progress towards a goal than as progress away from a problem. So not progress to, but progress from. So these processes then can be understood much, much better. If we look at some processes of progress, for example, let's focus for a while on scientific and technical progress. Here it's even more obvious that the metaphor of having a goal that is already set, like hiking a trail, and you know that you want to reach a certain point, is misleading. The person who developed the first punch card system did not already have the idea of a laptop or a modern large-scale computer system in mind. The inventor of the telephone did not think about today's smartphone. As undoubtedly as the invention of the wheel appears in retrospect as an indispensable step from the way to the racing car, it was not guided by the pursuit of the already known goal of modern racing. The path from eating raw meat to the sous vide method of upscale cooking, or that from the cave to the skyscraper, was equally followed without a defined endpoint. These processes can be understood much better if they are looked at as progressive solutions to problems that develop from one another and are driven by new problems arising. Clean drinking water was scarce in the European Middle Ages, so beer was brewed. To solve certain problems, including those related to warfare, people were dependent on processing large amounts of data, so they worked on compressing or increasing storage capacity and improving processors, without knowing where it would end. Technical and scientific progress therefore moves from problem to problem. It is driven by situations in which one wants or needs to prove something, in which the opportunity to do arises, and in which, if necessary, someone has an idea for solving the problem that proves to be productive and feasible. For this very reason, progress, to return to Philip Kitcher's catchy distinction, is not progress to, but progress from. This is no different, at least according to my thesis, in the case of social progress, even if problems and crises in this case are of a different order. Social progress, too, results from the occurrence of problems and the processes of searching for and finding a solution, which then again gives rise to new problems, and if things go well, new solutions. Here, too, the final goal is not known from the outside, or strictly speaking, there is no final goal. Social progress is then not affected or guided by a goal toward which it's supposed to run, but is driven by problems and problem-solving progress always progress away from the bad toward the better, without the latter being predetermined or final, and without a predictable end. In the words of Spanish poet Antonio Machado, a path is developed when one walks. And surprisingly, even Hegel, where a lot of, let's say, comic versions of his philosophy of history are around, who would say, I mean, we have this idea, I mean, this goal of freedom and everything moves towards us. Even in Hegel, you can see that let's say, the negativism of the kind of experiential progress that Hegelian dialectic describes is very much like this Machado idea of a path is born when someone walks, because this is all about the ways in which the realization of an idea, somehow constitutes the very idea and the norm itself. So even if freedom, or the other way around, freedom should not be seen as, even in Hegel, as this kind of trophy that you get at the end of a path that is already known and established, but is something that is in need of this process of experience itself. I'm going into detail here, but skip the Hegel part. So the primacy of progress. If progress is more problem-driven than goal-oriented, then there's also no independent good that dictates its direction in the first place and thus turns change into progress. And it seems that this independent good is no longer needed. The relationship of the good to progress can now be basically reversed. It is not that we only understand what progress is when we understand the good. It's the other way around. We understand what the good is once we understand progress. The notion of progress then has priority over the notion of the good. As again, Philip Kitcher puts it, ethical progress is prior to ethical truth. And truth is what you get by making progressive steps. So the whole idea here is that instead of conceiving of progress as a derivative normative concept, it is somehow the other way around, the priority of progress, which also means that people who defend this idea of process as a learning process just don't believe that it is so easy to pre-establish those norms or to get them from whatever other world. So progress as a learning process or an experiential process. Perhaps then the question, what is progress, as a question about progress as a noun is not properly posed at all. It might be better understood as a question about the possibility of progressive transformation, about progressive social change, that is, about progress in the adjectival sense. What interests us in this context is that less the result, the good achieved, than the progressive transition from one social state to another. It is the process itself that matters. Progress is then associated with the idea of learning, development, or experience. Experience. Suppose I woke up in the morning and could suddenly fly. Even if being able to fly was one of my long-cherished desires, it would hardly be accurate to say that I had made unexpected progress overnight in my flying skills. This is because I would hardly have learned to fly overnight. But such unrelated and unexpected changes are not only unlikely, both in terms of individual fortunes and in terms of social transformations. It is also clear from this example what is meant by the claim that progress or progressiveness is not absorbed in the evaluation effect. Progress has a temporal dimension. As a dynamic concept, it is a process that occurs over a period of time. And more than that, this time span is not homogeneous and empty, not simply a line that leads from one point to another. Something must happen that allows these points, these elements to relate to each other, emerge from one another, and in the best case, accumulate into an experience. Progressive change, then, is a particular kind of change, namely one that can be described as an accumulative process of learning or experience. If some kinds of change can conversely be described as regressive, it is because they are characterized by effects of unlearning, blocked experience, and reactive closure to experience. Progress, and this was my starting point, is change for the better. But that alone is not enough. In the search for a conception that is neither teleological nor deontological, and in which progress itself has a normative meaning, it has turned out that progress is not dependent on an already set goal. Understood as a problem-solving process, it can be conceived as progress from. The burden of justification now lies on describing this problem-solving process in a way that allows us to evaluate the quality of the problem-solving itself. The core of my proposal will be to describe this as a dialectical enrichment process or an accumulative and crisis-driven process of problem-solving. Such a problem resembles the movement described in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. In the course of what Hegel describes as an experiential process and an Erfahrungsprozess, where consciousness changes both along with the object and the understanding that consciousness has of itself, this change is not an unconnected, abrupt alteration of the object or a plain refutation of it. It involves an expanded understanding of one's situation and self, the dissolution of self-deception and one-sidedness guiding this experiential process. The situation is redefined and overcome with reference to a more comprehensive context in which it is embedded or with reference to the deficiencies of the previous description. The progress, the advanced situation is the result of a practical meta-reflection on what previously existed and of its process. Progress is then not simply about making things better, but about making them more comprehensive in a reflective sense. It involves an increase in experiential complexity, while regression means the loss of complexity in the process of falling below a certain level of complexity. The history of experience that emerges here can also be described with Dewey. Crises generate reflexivity that opens up to new courses of action. This process of enrichment, Anreicherung, accumulation, thus should not be imagined as linear. It is mediated through crisis and their resolution, in which the respective social formations are always at risk of perishing before they transform. Accumulation should also not be conceived quantitatively. An accumulative process in this dialectical sense always involves a qualitative change. It is not like a glass that increasingly fills. The glass itself changes in the process. And most importantly, for addressing the concerns articulated above, this is not a teleological concept, not an unfolding of a pre-given, or in the sense of the unfolding of a pre-given potential and task. Accumulation of growth in this sense does not follow a preset path or a number of certain stages. I will approach this understanding further by translating it into the process of problem solving and an understanding of progress as problem solving of a certain kind. This is what I call progress as second order problem solving. So progress is not just solving problems in a linear way, but it is solving a certain kind of problems that can be called second order problems. As I indicated above and discussed at length in my book, actually, wherever we experience progress, it is entire forms of life that change. The practices at work in these are interrelated and complex, albeit sometimes only loose ways. Now, according to me, these forms of life, understood as inert ensembles of social practices, are reactions to problem. In forms of life, reactions to problems are embodied attempts to solve the problems that arise for them and with them. This is the basis for understanding their dynamics and the conditions of their change. In forms of life solve problems, they are already normatively imbued and historically situated. They change when faced with new problematic situations, erosion and decay or crisis in their existing social practices and institutions, which they have partially co-produced. This is what, in Hegelian terms, would be called contradictions and the resolution of contradictions, but I have chosen to loosen this up a bit by talking about problems and then get the say the dialectical twist again. So I would like to briefly unpack this concept of forms of life as problem-solving instances. But let me skip to the second order quality of problem solving. So the idea is that progress is not just solving problems, but solving second order crises. And the thesis behind this is that forms of life, social formations, forms of life as forms of life, have certain kind of problems, not problems as such, and of course the question of what is actually a problem, what do we consider as a problem, what do we consider as a solution to a problem, comes up at this point. But I think there is an interesting, let's say, pragmatist way to deal with this question of, what kind of status problems have here. As Dewey famously says, you can't somehow talk away problems, you can't just make them go away. But on the other side, of course, there's no such thing as a problem without our interpretation of it as a problem. And so there's a constructive as well as, let's say, realist. But then for forms of life, the interesting and more important thing, and this is what the level on which progress or we can even start to speak about progress, is what I call second order problems. These are problems related to the conceptual and cultural resources available to a form of life to solve first order problems. For example, consider an agrarian society that is struck by a famine because it hasn't rained in months. The shortage of food is clearly a first order problem for the reproduction of this society. People are starved. A second order problem then arises when it turns out that for some reason the society is unable to respond to this first order problem with appropriate measures. Second order problems do not concern the immediate scarcity, it would be the first order problem, but rather the practices and institutions, the social resources that make it possible or impossible to respond to it. If, for example, droughts, I always have a problem pronouncing this. If they are a regular occurrence and the society still fails to react with appropriate measures, such as building storage facilities, then this inability to respond, the learning blockage and structural hindrances that hinder a rational engagement with the problem are second order problems. For example, when the governor of Utah calls on people to pray against the human-induced drying of the Colorado River, which he actually did in 2022. This can certainly be understood as a second-order problem or some kind of experiential blockage on his side. Another example would be a society that has the means to solve an economic crisis, as it is often the case with self-induced supply crises in a globally developed world economy, but lacks the political will to counter certain economic and ecological dynamics. If second-order problems or crises solidify, it is always an indication that established institutions, practices, beliefs, and self-conceptions of their society become questionable and dysfunctional. And since the perception of a problem, to even conceive of something as a problem or crisis, is already shaped by the normative expectations that come from and are addressed to a social order, forms of life are caught in crisis due to normatively predefined descriptions. Crises that forms of life encounter and through which they are driven beyond themselves and led to transformations are always also normative crises. So forms of life are problem-solving entities in this sense. They change when they are confronted with new problems or crises, which they, as Thomas Kuhn put it, have partly co-produced. Crises and phenomena of social erosion problems in a social order can have very different costs. There are cases where the social formation gets into a crisis due to external pressures or the confrontation with new circumstances, new technological developments, or other social forms of life, all the while helping no material, social, or moral resources to meet or overcome these challenges. Social practices and institutions can also run into difficulties or erode due to imminent contradictions. Entire social orders can become dysfunctional and lose legitimacy, potentially leading to spontaneous conflicts. For the question of progress, the following point is crucial. Progress or regression occurs where forms of life are confronted with second-order problems and can either cope with them or cannot. Cope with them would be progressive, to not be able to cope with them, regressive. As I mentioned earlier, forms of life are consistently faced with problems and are a progressive problem-solving dynamic. However, whether they are progressive or not is not determined by whether they simply solve the problems that trigger the development, but whether they can solve second-order problems, whether they possess the institutional resources and the according potential to initiate processes of reflection necessary to solve secondary problems. The question is not whether they actually, sometimes or frequently, solve problems, not even just whether they sometimes or frequently learn. The question is whether they have learned to learn, so to say. Social progress primarily means reflective progress in problem-solving capabilities. A second consequence of my approach can be made productive for the understanding of progress. If there are quite different problems that have to be solved within a social form or form of life, technical problems, problems of knowledge, problems of living together, political or social problems, the connection and the appropriate relationship between the different dimensions of progress can also be grasped on the level of second-order problem-solving potentials. Solving problems with technological advances, for example, is of no use if it cannot be thought together and made commensurable with the other dimensions of the social, the effects on social life and possible side effects. Solutions to economic problems, like the logic of exploitation, can come into opposition with possibilities of solutions to social problems. On the level of second-order problems, however, these are not separate dimensions. Progress in the development of productive forces that does not go well, to quote Walter Benjamin's formulation once again, for individuals, but also not for the world, is simply not progress. Progress thus becomes a meta-category of social change, change within change. The question of whether social change is progressive or regressive is then decided not least by the integration of precisely those moments. So let me open. Okay, last slide and last remarks on regression. This is fundamentally a negative approach. The non-teleological nature of orientation toward the dynamics of progress itself leads to the formal meta-category of non-regression. I have now arrived at a point that I want to address in this brief text on progress. To truly understand what progress is, he says, one must grasp it in relation to concepts of regression or backsliding. I quote, "A situation is conceivable in which the category would lose its meaning, the category of progress would lose its meaning, and yet which is not the situation of universal regression that allies itself with progress today. In this case, progress would transform itself into the resistance to the perpetual danger of relapse. Progress is this resistance at all stages, not the surrender to the steady ascent." So progress is neither, when understood deterministically, an almost automatic development, nor does it rely on reaching the end of the course of stages and thereby presenting a preconceived idea of the qualitative details of a rational organization of society as humanity. The resistance against regressive forces gains its specificity and direction from the progressive and concrete determination of these instances of regression. As opposites, the terms progress and regression illuminate the complexity of the historical process that we seek to understand. If progress is not just a linear approach to a predetermined positively valued state, but an enrichment process, then regression is not merely a linear step backward, but a fall back behind an already achieved position, which can be understood as unlearning the sense of a systematic blockage of experience. My proposal then is to understand regression as an experiential blockage and therefore as a deficient mode of crisis management and problem solving. If processes of progressive social transformation are those that can be seen as an appropriate response to contradictions and crisis, one can conversely speak of regression wherever crises are not addressed or are dealt with deficiently. Just as progress, in my sense, does not depend on a goal, regression is not a fallback behind a predetermined or set goal. Based on what has been said so far, we can draw some conclusions about the concept of regression and its significance in the analysis of social relations. First, regression is not a position, but a reaction. It is not a positive assertion, but a defense against social dynamics perceived as overwhelming and burdensome. In a political context, regressive positions should not be equated with conservative positions of preservation. Regression involves a return to a clinging to something that one cannot return to in the way envisioned, and that cannot be preserved. Regression responds to a problem with a sense of being overwhelmed and to a crisis with denial. A regressive response represents an inadequate processing of problems, a mode of unlearning, and an escape from both internal and external reality. In contrast to the accumulative process of a successful experiential process, regression then leads to impoverishment and depletion. If successful learning always includes an element of learning how to learn, not just learning about a subject, but also reflexively understanding how one learns, then regressive processes involve unlearning how to learn, and as it is, unlearning how to unlearn, how to adequately unlearn. Regressive ways of dealing with experiences are not only appropriate concerning the current phenomenon or situation as an avoidance strategy that block the possibility of further experiences which are essential for change. Regression is therefore a crisis in crisis resolution, a second-order phenomenon. It is not the inability to manage a crisis or social problem. It occurs where the means of problem perception or problem solving have already been systematically destroyed and rendered inaccessible. In such cases, not only are crises left unresolved, but they cannot be appropriately articulated, addressed, and crucially for the dynamics of social change, transformed into social conflicts. Speaking of regression, then, does not mean wanting to return to the status quo to the state before regression. While in the case of a simple setback, one may seek to restore the previous condition, effectively reversing it, this clearly cannot apply to the phenomenon of regression. It would be misleading and futile because the reasons for regression are already inherent in the previous state. So it's not that we have a good previous state and then regression, and if we want to reverse regression, we just go back to this previous state, but we have to look for the roots of the crisis in this very situation itself. Regression is part of a more comprehensive crisis scenario that must be addressed as the root of the crisis, at the root of the crisis. So when we talk, for example, about a democratic regression, the countermeasure cannot simply be a return to democracy as it was before. Unlike in the case of a temporary setback, the response to regression process cannot be a simple encore une fois, just make another effort. Regression affects the practice and the possibility of further progress itself, and it requires more than the resumption of the previous stage to overcome regressions. Therefore, the response to regressive development must reflect and work through the inherent causes of regression. The real point of Habermas' assertion that we cannot not learn is that progress, once an experience level is reached, is only reversible at a very high cost. The regressive fallback from what has been achieved is worse than the situation before the fallback or the situation to which one purposefully wants to return. The Nazi ideology of Blut and Boden, blood and soil, is worse than the pre-modern, I quote Marx again, idiocy of rural life, derided by Marx and Engels. And the aggressive community ideology of the contemporary far right is worse than the tradition-bound narrow-mindedness of an established group. In this sense, with normative and criterial constraints, history is not only moving forward sometimes and moving backwards at others. It is not only always different without any identifiable direction. The costs of regression can be assessed. And from this assessment of the costs, we can deduce how it could have been and should have been better. The regressives, as Adorno puts it, and this is my last quote, the regressives, as Adorno puts it, are traitors of the possible. They are not merely those who fall back behind an established state, but those who want to exterminate the admonishing possibility of something different, thus preventing emancipatory change. However, since progress and regression are modes of change within change, the alternative is between an appropriate and an inappropriate reaction to the tendencies, contradictions, crises, and conflicts underlying the given state. Socialism or barbarism, this was Rosa Luxemburg's very clear and unfortunately not entirely updated translation of this alternative. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. I in a few seconds, I think, oh, Fernando is ready.
I'm ready. I have so many questions. Thank you so much. This was really an incredible walkthrough of the many connotations and interpretations of progress. And I appreciate very much your effort of decoupling progress from teleology and maybe in a way saving Hegel from Hegel, which is always heroic and laudable. My question is, maybe two questions to think about, to talk about. I appreciate the problem-solving emphasis rather than moving toward a predetermined goal. But what if the political right, authoritarian movements are also problem-solving? Just you don't like their solutions, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily worse solutions. In fact, the bag could be quite mixed in terms of results. So for example, it could bring a lot of economic improvements at the cost of some, the restriction of some liberties. So at the second order that you're describing, it's not entirely blocking learning, it's just learning in a different way. So how then would we apply your approach to progress and regress to these movements? And then secondly, how does your narrative decouple progress from its deeply civilizational implications? So the civilizational discourse in which progress was embedded. I mean, you've mentioned colonialism, of course, but it's also, it's become, like, progress has become a catchword for all sorts of judgment about different conceptions of being human in the world. That are, what is a good life? What is justice? These are not universal. These are not uncontested, even within a particular culture. So how does moving it to the second order resolve this issue? Do we then, or can we then not simply use the second order criteria to judge between different cultures, different religions, different forms of life, different conceptions of being human? I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Should I start answering them?
You should.
Yes, answer. I think answer this.
Yeah, you should start.
I should start.
Yeah.
So I start with the second question. The very idea here, the very idea of having a look at how progress occurs, and this processual idea is to enable us to multiply. To allow for multiple paths towards paths that are progressive, not actually multiple paths towards progress, because I don't. I want to get rid of this substantial or noun of progress here and transform it into this processual approach. So the idea is that it multiplies, that it gives us a way to see multiple paths that are either progressive or regressive. So there would be a variety of forms of life, of ways to be human, of civil, I mean, conceptions of the good, whatever, however you want to call it. And at the same time, so this is the attempt to avoid the relativistic consequence of a certain idea of contextualization and context and a certain critique of universalism, and on the other side to avoid kind of the ontological universalism that would then always fall back, or is always in danger of falling back to this kind of imperialist judging upon other forms of civilization. So I want both. I want to judge. I want a discussion on the level of whether forms of life are adequate or not, rational or not, problem solving or not, and so on. And I want to have this discussion on, let's say, I mean, the idea is to neither avoid and neither like, what is the English expression in the German, Zoologisierung, like put those different cultures, different approaches, different ideas of the good, to petrify them and put them into something. Okay, so this wonderful pluralism, and we can't even talk about the adequateness, goodness, whatever. That we're not even a conversation that. I mean, this is of course another like conviction that I have, that in order to further processes of emancipation, we have to get into a conversation about like those substantial matters, worldviews, concepts of how to be human, what to be human. I mean, both, not just like ethical questions, but the way in which ethical and you can call it, if you can call it cosmological questions are defined and so on. So this is an attempt to find not a middle path, but to take serious the multiple contexts, and at the same time try to find a way to enter into a comparative actual discussion about this. So it's not avoiding, maybe because you said that we will fall back to this kind of judgmental. I mean, I'm not talking about, I mean, you should be judgmental here in the bad sense, but the idea is that that the way in which, say, functional and normative aspects are intertwined in the idea of problem solving, should give us, let's say, another not an easy solution to, I mean, what is the best way of life, but a way to get into a conversation in a situation in which, as I mean, Hilary Putnam said at some point, I mean, everyone pretends that this is about we are arguing about the best way of life, but in fact we have, I mean, neither of us has found a good way of life already. So this is the kind of idea that one should get rid of, or that one should not avoid those conversations, which also means should not avoid to judge upon better and worse ways of transformation, paths of transformation, but at the same time not. I mean, just to give you an easy example, or maybe a surprising example, I mean, what happens when we give up the idea that it is approaching a preset goal. Let's see it something like to see gender as a spectrum, which is something that we could claim in these parts of our society. At least this is what I think what a lot of political struggle, as well as a lot of people would say that to conceive of gender in different terms, and the fact that we have more than to gender and so on is something that we've achieved that could be seen as progress. There are societies who have conceived of, I mean, who had like 15 different genders, I mean, from the very beginning. So would one then say that they are more progressive than we are? Maybe, maybe not. And this depends on the role that a certain understanding of gender roles has played. It depends on the context. It depends on whatever. So I wouldn't say that from the very beginning we are like behind those civilizations that already knew. I mean, this is because it's not just about knowing something about reality, but a certain way we our social institutions are, I mean, historically transformed, reversed, fought on, and so on. So this is the idea that it's not if it's not the effect, the outcome that we use in order to judge upon progressive or regressive social change, then we would have those multiple paths. And the question of whether this is progressive or not is a question. And I mean, question is whether you. I would say the most universal thing here is that societies are dynamic, that they undergo transformations of a certain kind, and that those transformations are not just designed, created out of whatever the will of the actors, but something that is in an interaction with problems in the most material sense. And that is, you could of course say, yeah, but then you impose the idea of dynamics, so the idea of learning process is something that is imposed upon those societies who might not, I mean, neither learn or want to learn, nor are crisis-driven dynamics and so on. But at this point, I would say, I don't know, the idea that there are cultures that are, so to say, cold and not dynamic, not confronted with problems, seems to be highly implausible. And even somehow this kind of romanticized colonial perspective where you romanticize this kind of, oh my God, and these cultures are so, let's say, missing a word here, but self-sufficient and self-sufficient, this kind of self-sufficient happiness that is somehow, I mean, through a certain kind of civilizational lens imposed or, I mean, seen in other cultures. Yeah. So, yeah. So this would be the answer to the second question. And the other question: what if the right, the political right, is also problem solving? Of course they are. Of course they see themselves as problem solving. So what I'm suggesting here is that one should confront it on the level of normative, I mean, of a certain kind of problem solving. It's important for me that it's not just factual problems. It is, I mean, normatively improved problems already. But this changes the terrain. Again, it's a shift in the terrain in which we confront them. So I mean, one easy solution is to say, yeah, the left is problem solving, the right is problem solving. We just don't like. I mean, as you said, we just don't like the way they learn. And my suggestion here is to find the deficits in the learning process itself. Just, I mean, to judge this as regressive is again another move than just to normatively to confront them with pre-established, pre-given a set of norms, because then you only have two options. I mean, either they are just, I mean, the problem is that you either then have an agonistic political situation where you say, okay, so they're learning, we're learning, they are just doing the wrong thing, but wrong, not in my sense of a wrong solution to a crisis, but yeah, then it's only like a fight, which in the end might be the, I mean, politically spoken, in the end, this might be the only way to go. This is not something I would deny, but the question is again on the level of whether we are able to analyze what's going on there in a meaningful way that would allow us for more than like the kind of, let's say, normative I mean, that would be more than just, let's say, in a Hegelian mode, an empty moral, I mean, to set moral convictions against other moral convictions in a way of an empty art. And that's all that this is about, I would say.
We have a party termination, signed 5 with Robert, Chris, Jean, Max, Nico. Probably I will recall.
Maybe we can collect the questions so that I hear every one.
Okay, I'm okay with, yeah,
question.
okay, so maybe we can collect, we have a 30 minutes, let's try to collect. We start with the 2, so Robert and Chris.
So thank you so much for studying. It's incredibly rich and very much looking forward to reading the book. I had a question that follows up a little bit on values, but I want to pose it in a slightly different way, from a different perspective. So it connects a little bit to the question of imperialism, but from a different vantage point. Not so much the more intuitive concern is that imperialism would be a concern for non-Western societies that are being imperialized, but I want to think about it more from the standpoint of a kind of internal critique of it. Because the primary axis on which progress is being described here is, of course, temporal, and that makes a lot of sense, that it's a question about change over time. But what if we think about also a kind of spatial axis? So in addition to change over time, there is also a kind of universalizing of one form of life's learning process. So that what's happening is 2 things at once. Both there is the change over time in the learning process, but also a kind of generalization of one form of life's learning process. So you're moving also from plurality to singularity over time. Now, the problem with that, from the internal perspective, let's say that's completed, so it's totalizing, so that by the end there is only one form of life and one learning process, and it meets its own internal criteria and standards for progress, problem solving in a second order. The problem with that is that that form of life might have a hard time conceptually distinguishing progress from just de facto totalization. That it wouldn't be able conceptually to tell the difference between whether there had been progress or just a kind of totalization of all forms of life into one. Because it wouldn't be objectionable from the standpoint of the people internal to that, and there wouldn't be left anyone external to it to object to it. But we would be concerned, because we have this niggling doubt that we could never tell the difference between genuine progress and just de facto totalization of our form of life. How would we resolve that?
Fortunately, we're never
Oh my
going
God.
to
Can I answer right now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Well.
Okay, I mean, thank you so much for,
Wait, we're gonna have 2 questions.
okay.
It's okay,
yeah.
she can finish. But, go ahead.
No, I was,
Well, I got just an observation.
what is your name, son?
It's Chris.
Chris.
Little related to what Robert said, and that is, I wonder if, I wonder if it's significant that when European notions of progress took shape in the 18th century, it was at the time of a confrontation with a society in imperial China that was superior to theirs in every way, materially, socially, social welfare, etc. And that, and since this didn't take the shape for kind of emulation of the art to emulate China, but a different trajectory. You know, if that sort of characterization from the beginning affects things
in any way. But my main question was really about learning, and because it is, you wanted to pull away from a kind of Ericksonian learning as development, as human development, towards another area. But I wonder if learning itself already presumes the change that it is, the change or the telos that it wants. I mean, I wonder how purely processual you can get without having a kind of optimal learning situation. I mean, you just, in answer to Juan's question, you talked about, the right kind of learning and the wrong kind of learning, the right learning, and so what creates that? Doesn't the right kind of learning need to be created or need to be posited external to the process itself?
Okay, so. Okay, Robert, thank you so much for putting these questions in such an interesting way. So in the end, I think this boils down to the distinction between internal critique and an immanent critique. The way I would describe internal and immanent critique, I mean, it's meaning that, I mean, just a short version of it, that internal critique is the kind of critique that where you have like established norms and an established social practice, and then the social critiques spell out how one is not, one doesn't live up to the other. And immanent critique, as I understand it, in a more Hegelian, left-Hegelian way, is triggered by crises and contradictions that come from somewhere. So in my conception of an immanent critique, the possibility for critique, and I start from the end of your remark, the possibility for critique does not come from the fact that there is still someone who is outside of the social formation, and it's not, so the idea is that those moments of crisis, and I would conceive of crisis as some kind of dysfunctionality, that, I mean, it is important, I think, to distinguish crises and conflicts, and of course, crises have to be turned into conflicts at some point, but still, I mean, this, as everything I do here sounds very old-fashioned, but I do somehow, I'm somehow still in favor of the idea that there's such a thing as a, let's say, the objective side of a crisis, with all those like, that has to be transformed. It's again an interpretation and so on. But there's something that, I mean, in a pragmatist spirit that shows that is a distraction. Things do not go smoothly anymore, and so on. So the question of how to distinguish progressive change from change in terms of just totalization would not in terms of an immanent to just throw out, I mean, any kind of philosophy of history. I mean, one thing is that, as Manu has already said, I want to say Hegel from Hegel here, or Hegel from very bad interpretations of Hegel. I think it's much more interesting as a theory of social change than a lot of people would, do think. The spatial axis here. So one of the reasons for wanting to throw the social theoretical transformation theoretical side out with the bathwater is exactly what I referred to when I said, according to Marx, the world spirit is the world market, the fact of totalization. So we are living in a situation where we do not have those little islands of self-sustained culture, social formations who live according to and some who are not affected by each other. I mean, you might say, unfortunately, not so, but whatever. This is the fact of modern global life that we are not even talking about this. That we have to. Talking about progress or regression, we already have to take into account this kind of the confrontation. And I would then say, you say in the end we only have one form of life. This is actually something that Adorno, when he talked about nationalism and regression, spells out beautiful when it says, so nowadays cosmopolitanism seems to be the more realistic position, because as a matter of fact, we are already in this kind of a totalized situation. But apart from this, with my approach, it wouldn't, I mean, normatively spoken, for each kind of problem-solving process, for each path, there are normative equivalents. So there are better and worse, adequate and less adequate solutions to certain social problems and contradictions that evolve out of a social structure. But there are also functional equivalents. You can solve problems in this or in that way, and sometimes there might be. I mean, so there's room for variety as well as for judging upon better or worse. So it's exact. So normatively spoken, this procedure would not even in an ideal and that, I mean, it's out of the question anyway, would not end up in a situation, and also not a good totalization. I mean, a lot of theories, left-wing theories would in the end think that, okay, we have a bad totalization now, but after the revolution, we will have a good, totalized, generalized situation and a universal way of living. This is not the result of what I'm talking about, because of this kind of functional equivalent thing. So, which also means that then, there are different paths, and if you take history seriously, once we have chosen this solution instead of another, it leads to a whole, like, a chain of series of problems that then need to be solved, and that would lead to a completely different situation than if you had started otherwise. So, normatively spoken, it's not. This is not a normative idea of universalization as totalization or generalization. But as a matter of fact, talking about the way the world is, of course, the tendency is. I would say the tendency is both. We have universalization, we have this kind of the totalizing moments, but even the totalizing moments affects societies in different ways, and they react in different ways. So I would say we always have both. Like the totalizing moment that is still, I would say, in order to come to terms with it in an explanatory mode, even we would have to not to start with the idea of totality, or to start with analyzing the totality of those global societies, but to start bottom up, so to say, and then to figure out how those influences and how the respective reactions to each other that are not, I don't need to be harmless in terms of, okay, so they are reacting to each other. They are, the reactions are, have a form of domination and exploitation. So this is, Chris, learning. Does it need, I would say an optimal learning situation is different from an optimal outcome of learning, and a stages idea, a certain kind of developmental idea of learning. One of the things that I like about Dewey's theory of learning is not only that it is quite somewhat crisis induced as well. It's one of the interesting elements in this theory of education, that it is always about problem comes up, the situations can be solved, and we start figuring out what this is about. We try to distinguish things that we already know from like things that we don't. We then have to come up with innovative solutions. We try them out. We have this kind of trial and error model here, but it is all like driven by those problems, crises, uncertainties, and so on. And I think this line, when he says it is about learning that enables further learning, or experiences that enable us to even have, to further experiencing. This is something that, where I took my clue from with respect to why not try to establish criteria in terms of those blockages to experience. And I don't think that this, this is somehow, this is problem driven, but also in a specific way negativistic. And you don't like that?
No, I was thinking also, Rancière, of a model of learning that, sort of actually builds on, the sort of the vision, the social telos in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
You have it 4P.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to
G.
shorter.
Nico, Max, Key, or Key Max, so I can be the last. G.
Well, thank you for that. Well, it gave me a lot to think about, and brought me to my own current state of confusion in a good way. Right through the critique of the critique, I found myself very much with you. And, the idea after the Foucauldian moment when what we were losing was any ability to talk about interconnectedness, crisis, social transformation, real world developments, let's say, that and the interconnectedness of the world. I'm very much with you there, and for me, I said, then you said, but to recapture this or make space for this, we need to have a new idea of progress. And that is where you lost me, because I thought when you were saying that about knowing an ability to grasp the world and all of its interconnectedness and its various developmental trajectories, I thought, okay, well, this is a realism of world history. Why not just don't abandon the idea of progress and embrace the idea of world history? That would be my question. Okay, but then that leads to a sort of ontological question about how are we thinking about history in this exercise? We abandon teleology, I'm all for that, but do we abandon linearity? I don't think by choosing progress and regression, it seemed to me you were definitely not abandoning linearity, because there's one of these is going this way and the other kind of is going that way. Understood that this dynamic can take place in many different contexts, but nonetheless, history is going somewhere. And some of it we're going to call progressive, and some of it we're going to call regressive. And regressive is not about going back, as you clearly said. Regressive, as you described it, is simply blocked learning. Okay, it's the inability to learn. So, however, what that does then is really narrows the ontological field of historical possibilities, it seems to me. As I remember Hegel, when Hegel wanted to open the way for something unexpected, the cunning of reason, I remember he would say, well, the world spirit will circle back and find out there were things in its past it thought were passé, but really were prefiguring something that we're already doing now, you know, so the present always has more in it than we expect. And so, okay, that's just within the Hegelian universe. But, I don't operate all the time, certainly, or try not to within that universe. In the world, in the universe of world history in a realist mode, we see that the totalizing projects, you know, we said we have only one way of, really only have one way of life now. I really reject that on empirical grounds, if I can be permitted that, but also on sort of theoretical grounds. And I'm a bit of a post-structuralist. I think every totality is constituted outside. There will be something left out, which can always come back to re-enter and displace the unity. I think this has happened with, you know, historically and realistically, with all sorts of excluded, quote unquote, or silenced populations and people. I go to Stuart Hall for that, you know, the sort of return of the margins, you know, into the center. And I don't think that's a process that has happened just once with so-called decolonization, which is, of course, many things and far from over. But, you know, it didn't just happen. This is something, in my view, is processual and will continue to happen always. And so then, my question is linearity. Are we all in our different but connected ways, moving generally in a sort of a kind of common direction? You talked about, you know, progress forward, progress back. How about progress to the side, sideways progress? I mean, I've been trying to open up my imagination to that, and I'll tell you, ontologically, I come down to a vision of history that I associate with Darwin, Charles Darwin, you know, where we have a process of learning, survival, which is the process of learning to deal with specific environments and so on and so forth. And all of these creatures are doing this in historical time together. And in some way they're moving together in a direction, but non-teleologically, there's no, you know, this is not the Darwinism of, you know, the progressive evolutionists. Evolution is not progressive, it's adaptive. Okay, so if we stick, you know, embrace the notion of historical developments as multi-directional and adaptive, but we're like progress and regression, you know, progress and regression and so forth. These seem to me to really just align things too much in a narrow linear way. I'm looking for a much bushier narrative, you know, or something like that. Okay, you see why I said that you brought me to my point of confusion, but this is where I'm struggling to think ontologically about history as a former, I hope, but still yet a Western subject. And I think, you know, I'm not sure that your model of progress and regression has really grappled either with the ongoing risk of ethnocentrism, which I think can't be reduced to imperialism and colonization, but it's a much deeper thing. You know, it has to do with a bit of Gavinian in thinking about the inevitability of prejudice and that kind of thing, and translation. Okay, I've just thrown 1,000 things in your direction, and you could comment on any or none of them. By the way, my name is Jim Cooper. I'm a former professor in this department.
Thanks for all the suggestions. Thank you.
Nico.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry I'm not there with you. Thank you so much for a great talk. I wrote my questions in the chat if it's easier to read. I'm a professor in the philosophy department. I have two rather specific questions. one question is, this is just for a clarificatory question, and I'm sorry if I missed it at the beginning of the talk. I had a hard time connecting. So I take it you're interested primarily in progress as a concept that applies to social change. So, for example, when I say I made progress on a paper today, that's not what you're interested in. And I gather. And the question then is, do you think your account transfers to this more quotidian types of progress? That's my first question. And my second question was about this account you give that, if I'm not misunderstanding, but if I am, I apologize. So this view of viewing progress as a process or a procedure, and then of not having it be parasitic on the concept of good or on a goal that we set for ourselves. And I find that idea just fascinating, honestly, if it's correct. But I find myself wondering then what the criteria are for judging that something is progress. And I'm thinking in particular of cases where, so just as an example, you have a social transformation and you initially, or we all judge initially that it was a good thing. So it was progress. But then actually later on, we're like, oh, we were wrong. That actually wasn't progress. We were wrong about that. And I tend to think, for example, that gay marriage might be one of these cases where it was judged to be broad progress and it might turn out it wasn't. But that's just a silly example. You can pick another one if you like. But the reason why I'm thinking of examples like this is because it seems like in order to judge that something was or wasn't progress and whether we were right or wrong, we do appeal to the notion of goodness. And so I want to understand how that works. And that's it. Thank you so much again.
I would say, let's collect the other two questions. Because we've already.
You can't answer all.
I'll try to be very brief.
Yeah.
You can answer all of these.
Yeah.
I really want to hear the answers.
The real progress.
You want to go first?
Sure, I'll try to be brief. Thank you. I just want to reiterate what people have said about the richness talk. Actually was just before this writing about, coincidentally, your work and this question of space.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm tempted to ask about it, but I wanted to just draw attention to one related issue, and that's how you ended your talk on this on the issue of the possible, especially with respect to Adorno's position. It's a tempting position, like situating repression as hostile or traitorous to the possible. But I just wonder if there's a risk, at least in Adorno, of a kind of there's many ways of reading that, but of a sort of non-dialectical reading of that statement. This is sort of, as I understand it, Ray Brassier's argument with respect to Adorno and Marcuse on the antinomy of progress. And basically, he's arguing that Adorno cannot allow for a utopian possibility that is realizable. I can't get into his argument, but this gets to the question I want to ask, and that's what happens if regression is maybe not just conceived as a blockage to the possible or to progress, but forms part of the social fabric of the place of progress. So I'm thinking of regression as a bit more imminent to something like forms of life. So just a quick example. When I was listening to your talk, I was thinking of something like if we could speak about environmental destruction or ecological destruction in terms of a kind of regression, or even technology. Technologies like in this room, we're being structured by technologies that some people today find a bit regressive for various reasons. So I'm just wondering if if rather than just a reaction, we can understand regression in a more environmental sense. One place that I was wanting to go with this question was, so it's Henri Lefebvre, he doesn't talk about forms of life, but his concept of everyday life is very similar because he does engage with the question of ensembles of social practices. And for him, I think regression, this idea of life lagging behind what is technically possible, is very important. And I think you run into teleological problems that way. But I think what I'm trying to get at is a different kind of spatial question. What happens when we think about the effects of regression, and do those structure what is possible or progress?
Last question. I wanna build on something that James said. Evolution and history. If we work with Darwin and I would say Jay Gould, history is a multi-direction, is a bush, has many trajectories, many ways. But especially in the human, maybe in history in general, but in human history, many branches have been crushed, cut off.
Many,
Branches, many paths have been cut, have been crushed.
yes.
Yeah.
And new sprouts are growing.
Sometimes, yes, sometimes don't. Because I'm thinking. So, and some of these branches, these paths that have been crushed and cut off, they can be described in terms of possibilities. So, my first question is basically, how do we apply categories like progress and regression to the concreteness of these historical possibilities? So if I go back to to one of my favorite cases, that is the 1525 Peasants' War and Thomas Pincer, that trajectory was crushed, was replaced, and peasants were massacred. And there was a process, if you want, a process of learning with the Reformation and the new political process of the princesses and authorities. There was a process of learning individual freedom, individual rights. That is what Hegel celebrates when he celebrates Luther and the Reformation. That process of learning comes together with the process of unlearning, because common obligations and common rights, and that language, that legal language, has been repressed and forgotten. So again, this is a kind of a possibility that we don't know. It was just stopped, blocked. So if I call this possibility as a blocked possibility, that the entire trajectory of the Reformation, Luther, and the political modernity becomes a regression, because it is characterized by the blockade of another possibility. So basically, I can start working on a different idea in which the entire modernity is a regression. I don't think I'm not alone, but But I think my starting point is different from the starting point of some conservatives.
You and Lake Strauss.
Because now, so the last citation was Adorno, who said that the regressive are the traitors to the possible. I would say Benjamin would have said yes, and the progressives are the same, the traitors to the possible. So now the question, for the reason I say, because if we call Luther progress, yes, that is exactly how you crush the possible. And so normatively speaking, to what extent progress and regression are categories to discipline the possible. And basically, they can be tested and checked only, I think only, this is my position, only if we start applying to these categories to the concreteness of our historical past. So we, in a certain way, and this is I'm more on the side of Kant that you didn't consider. Because Kant, when he's talking about progress, basically is talking about one event that happened. And because it happened, it means it was possible. Because it's possible, we have to act according to that possibility. And that event is the French Revolution. And then he says, oh, we have to take part from that event. That is the French Revolution. So in a certain, my question is, these categories require to be positioned in historical events and to be tested all the time in these historical events. Then we can talk more.
Okay, if I was to create another slide, I would put a bush on it in order to try to, in how many minutes to answer to all those questions. Okay, let's maybe I can at least address some of you, some of the concerns that both of you articulate. Yes, history is a bush. And the idea of multiple paths and still the possibility of to judge where something goes wrong. I think, I actually do not think that my approach brings in the kind of linearity that you expect me or think I bring in. So the idea that in the end we are all, how did you put it? We will, in still linear fashion, move towards progress, all of us, even if in different ways. This is actually not what not only not what I expect to happen, but this is also not the way I would analyze.
Toward
so I would buy
not toward anything, but moving together in a interconnected way.
Different kinds of problems, different material preconditions, different setups, different choices when it comes to functional equivalence, different movements contradictions may be contradictions, but one has to, work them out.
Didn't you also say that we are now all in a one single thing?
That was Robert who.
No, you said I said you said it about where we are now.
No, there's a tendency. There's this totalizing tendency, but I would say and it was Robert who pointed out this spatial dimension and the threat. I would say that everything is. Here I'm actually more on your side, thinking that there's always the outside, and there are different kinds of outside, and there are different kinds of dealing with the outside, making other things at the outside now, and so on and so on. So I would say that this is why I was talking about the bottom up use of the category of totalization. That we should be very careful not to buy into the picture where we have this totalizing view of society. On the other hand, I think we should get away from let's say the departmentalization of social theory, or the kind of giving up. Again, giving up on the idea of totality might be as wrong as buying into full-blown idea of totality here. And when it comes to the empirical analysis, I would say, there might be, and there are, and we shouldn't underestimate those totalizing tendencies. But I think one thing that we have learned from, all those, not only political and social movements, but also the theoretical efforts to get rid of, this simple-minded idea of totality here or of the economy bringing about, I mean, like in a totalizing way. So I mean, I just take it that we are, this is progress and theory at least, that we're not buying into this picture. So here, I mean, I would say on the side of the Bushes, the theories, histories of Bush, yeah, but still those branches go somewhere, some of them lead to nothing, some are cut off. And I mean, talking about the crushed possibilities, the crushed branches, I mean, of course, it is not easy to say in retrospect where we would have been if those branches would not have been cut off. And there's nothing that would prevent me from saying so, prevent me from, let's say, I mean, one of the things about the linear conception, the idea that there's no loss. I mean, yeah, there is something to be. I mean, some things might have to be rescued or can be rescued. It's always important to, I mean, find things in a concrete historical situation. It's always important to see that. At this point, I mean, let's take the French Revolution, and I mean, in terms of its effects on gender equality, there have been branches in the French Revolution where the path to gender equality and I mean, seeing women as citizens would have been open, and those branches have been cut off. And we now see how, I mean, what a dramatic the process of regression was a result of cutting off those branches. I mean, there might be some branches and some possibilities that have been cut off without consequences that we know about. But getting back to the question, I tried to combine, or getting back to your question, Nico, about the retrospective. I mean, about maybe things might be considered as progress, but then in retrospect, it's not. I totally agree. This is, I mean, in fact, this is a retrospective, I mean, or let's say a view that is always in retrospect. And of course, it can turn out, I mean, the example gay marriage might be a good example, but it's a good example in various ways. It's a good example because in order to I mean, I'm just guessing what you have in mind, but what I would have in mind with respect to this example would be that there is some kind of, let's say, buying too much into traditional ways of life that come with the idea of gay marriage, is somehow buying into a lot of our philosophical beliefs conceive of progress as enlarging the circle, right? I mean, we already know, I mean, we have like rights of citizens and human rights or whatever, seeing each other as free and equal, and then there are people outside of the circle that are not even considered humans, and then, I mean, step by step, first like the workers, then women, then and so on, and open-ended, who is now considered to be within the circle. And I mean, my critique here would always be this means that we don't change the circle, and this also underestimates how including those groups in the circle, I mean, not only is in need of a paradigm change, but also actually affects one. I mean, so from this perspective, I would say that getting back to the gay marriage example, so why would this not be progress? Maybe because it has narrowed down a way, let's say, broadly speaking, non-traditional ways of life into a traditional one, and has only invited gay people to become like us. I mean, this idea of progress means that we see even more people as so they are like us, instead of changing the paradigm. But maybe, I mean, if you think that, I mean, there has been a lot of debate from the very beginning about the gay marriage, the conservatism of it. So maybe it wasn't progressive from the very beginning. But the way you suggested it, and let's just take it that at a certain point it seemed to be progress, and now it turns out it's not. This now it turns out that it's not in some way would still be, one thing is you can just figure out in retrospect that things have side effects that you were not aware of, and that turns something that is, that had good intentions into something bad. But this is a trivial case. The other case is that only after granting equal rights to certain groups, they will be able to articulate the kind of paradigm change that they had in mind, or that could have come along with including them in the first place. So this would then be a progressive trajectory, even if you, in the end, give up on the idea of, you could say, okay, first step is, I'm just guessing it, first step is gay marriage, second step is abolition of marriage at all. For everyone, because we analyze marriage as something that has a very problematic effects and so on. So why not? And then it could nevertheless be a very important step to. The gay marriage kind of inclusion that turns out to be the wrong kind of inclusion because it's not transformative enough, or doesn't even take into account the transformative element that was in it, might still be a step on in this experiential learning process I'm talking about. I haven't made up my mind how to judge on this case, but I think it's a good case for, and all of these moments, like judging in retrospect that something has not been as progressive because it has blocked further. Let's say, and we don't know this yet, let's say the experience of having gay marriage institutionalized will actually lead to retraditionalization. Does this word exist? Retraditionalizing and so on. Or will prevent those who are not affected by gay or not gay marriage, will prevent them from working on transformative and emancipatory forms of living together that are beyond marriage, and so on and so on. So if this turns out to be the case, then what has been, what has been considered progress is not. And then it was either a wrong, so then there is still more than one possibility. One is the kind of still a cumulative process that I just invented. The other would be, no, it really was it was not only a dead end, but something that was turned against the very intentions of the step towards progression that everyone had in mind when they thought about, for gay marriage. So this is how we figured. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And the account is very rich and wonderfully complex. And I kind of just want to sit with you and think about cases now, but we don't have time. But that was helpful. Thank you for going through the example. Yeah, and you were on the right track on what I was thinking as far as the judging of gay marriage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see whether I can get back to the bush. This would again be an example. Yeah. Thank you so much for. I'm going to. The bush thing will find its way into my thinking, but also the traitors. No, that was Max traitors of the progressive traitors of the possible as well. We'll talk about this. Thank you so much for asking all these questions.
Thank you for the talk.